he has lots of experience as a history teacher. He is also a very brilliant man, as well as being a very kind and generous man. And I'm going to pass over to him now for the last session of the day. Alex.
Thank you ever so much, Matt, and welcome everybody. Thank you ever so much for that probably too kind introduction, I have to say. It's brilliant to be here this evening, having spent a day in some fantastic sessions run by really inspirational people. And I think it's always a wonderful thing when we come together as a community of teachers and history teachers especially, to think about those problems that we face in the classroom, those issues that we face every day, and particularly as new teachers, learning from maybe some of the experience of the people who've been doing that for a longer period of time, but equally going away and trialing that and coming back and having conversations about it as well. So, as Matt says, tonight's session is called Fighting for What We Believe, and it's all about that theme that's been picked up by a number of people today about being part of a community or communities of practice. I know Catherine Byrne mentioned that this morning in the first session, and it's come up again and again and again throughout the day today. So there's kind of three themes that are going through: the power of being part of communities, what can we get out of them, the responsibilities of being part of them, and maybe some of the problems as well in terms of community practice. And I'm kind of speaking this. This is a lovely photo of me that I dug out. This is RQT me, and it's me at my first ever school. It was a middle school in Hightown, in quite a deprived area, and you can play Spot Me if you want to. It's good fun. But I'm trying to speak here also to NQT me and RQT me, and hopefully coming on to some of the things that I wish I'd known at the start of my career. First of all, about communities of practice, and sometimes particularly as an NQT in this very small school, you can see the staff there. That's all the staff of that school. It was shut down in the second year I was there for all kinds of reasons, which I'm not going to go into here. But that's the entire staff there, including the cleaning staff. So it was a very tiny school, and sometimes I felt quite isolated and divorced from communities of practice. I know Catherine talked about a similar experience earlier today as well. But also then moving on in my career, and actually then maybe going the other way too much and being completely overwhelmed with the numbers of communities I was dedicating or trying badly to dedicate my time to. So I'm going to speak to that experience. The picture on the right was just to give you an idea of what the school was like by the end of that 2 years, by the way. So that's a classroom as it looked on the last day the children were in, with having all the stuff having been taken out and the windows of the classrooms having been smashed about 2 months before we shut, and nobody actually replacing anything because they were shut in the school. So it was quite a baptism of fire as a school to work in. And so I kind of think about, well, what do I wish I'd had access to back in those days, or rather, what do I wish I'd actually bothered to access when I was there? It's also going to tap into some of the things that have come through the new Ofsted framework. And those of you who spent any time in school will know that the revised Ofsted framework that came out in 2019 substantially shifted the emphasis on how schools are assessed from looking at exam results primarily as the way of measuring schools, to thinking about the kind of curriculum that schools teach. And we've seen that in some of the discussions that have gone on today. I was in Hannah Cusworth's session earlier today, where she was talking about the thinking she'd been doing around curriculum especially. But that's also led to much more discussion about the role of professional communities in designing curriculum, building curriculum, maintaining curriculum. And you can see here Rachel D'Souza, who is the chief exec of the Inspiration Trust, talking about lively subject communities being crucial to good curriculum. We can see here Christine Council talking about the long-standing traditions of practice and debate within subject communities that exist. And the new ITE standards, the Initial Teacher Training Education Standards, ask teacher trainers like myself to direct trainees towards subject communities. So that idea of the history teaching community, which again we've heard a bit today, is kind of a hot topic, to the point that almost you'd imagine that it had been invented in the 2019 Ofsted framework. Of course, it hasn't. It's existed for much longer than that. What I want to go into, though, is something of, well, what are these professional communities? And I want to make a really clear point here. It is very much professional communities, and not, as we often talk about in a kind of shorthand, the history teaching community. So I'm going to touch on some of those things. I think we all kind of have a sense of what a community is and what that involves. And actually, the hallmarks of being part of a professional community are pretty similar. So if we think about professional communities, we might think about some of these things. Within a professional community, we often share experiences of teaching, especially, of course. We might share values. We might share a sense of identity of being part of that community of practice. And those three things together enable us to take action. And that's very similar to the communities we exist in outside of professional communities as well. And if you think about some of the way that local communities, for example, have responded to the lack of free school meals over the course of this year and last academic year, there has been a real sort of community action that's come out of that as well. Now, if we take that over to professional communities, there's some really nice work done by Love and Wenger in the 90s, looking at what professional communities were and what they were for and how they operate. And they talk in particular about professional learning communities. And that idea that when we are in these communities of professional practice, it's not just about being in them, but actually taking part in them as well. So we are learning through our presence in those communities. And they put aside a number of things that tell us about what professional learning communities are. I just want to pull out 5 here, because I think they help us understand the role of professional communities and why they might be so powerful. So first of all, they say they have shared aims or principles. They're often built from the ground up. So it's very rare you get professional communities that are imposed from the top. People often create them out of a need. They're bound by mutual engagement in the act of professional learning. So that's the aim of them. We want to learn things and we want to get better at what we do. And therefore, they result in a shared body of resources, shared vocabulary, shared understanding, shared pedagogies. And today you'll have already heard some of the shared vocabulary of the many history teaching communities out there. I've definitely heard people talk about things like second order concepts, inquiry questions. People have been talking cognitive load, which comes from other professional communities. And for some of you, those would have been terms that are alien, and some they'll have been terms that are familiar. And they kind of speak to a community. That the act of participating in and shaping that community is more important than the resources and pedagogies acquired from them. So being part of a professional learning community isn't the same as going on TES resources and looking for some ideas. It's about being part of the conversation, and that being a really powerful, really important part of the process. And then, of course, they allow their members to refine their practice. And in this case, in terms of teaching, that we have better impact on the students who are in front of us. And all of us, as part of our professional lives, will be part of professional learning communities of one sort or another. And what I want to focus on very particularly is what that looks like in history teaching. But before I get to that, I want to do something that just maybe grounds this a little bit more, because I think it's worth thinking about what can powerful professional communities enable. And to do that, I'm going to introduce you to one of my history heroes. And I don't know how many of you know or recognize this as Marc Bloch, who was an historian born at the kind of turn of the last century, and a French historian specifically. And of course, Bloch has had many identities in his professional career. He had many identities as a member of the French Third Republic initially, and he was very much a proud Republican and believed in those Republican ideals of liberty, fraternity, equality, the fundamental rights of all human beings. But he was also a Jewish historian, and he was part of the Jewish community of Alsace, where he was born. And beyond that, he was part of a number of professional communities. So he was a scholar. He was definitely a scholar. He taught at the University of Strasbourg and later in Paris at the Sorbonne. And he was a historian. And importantly for me, he was a medievalist as well. So Bloch was part of a number of communities and a number of professional communities. And those things shaped his identity and they shaped his ability to engage with his teaching of history and his public works of history and the writing that he did in history. But I'm using Bloch as an example because I think he gives us a really lovely insight into what professional communities can do, because Bloch doesn't just become a member of a professional community in terms of being a historian, for example, but he also founds a professional community. And the community he founds, which becomes known as the Annales School, after the journal, which you can see on the left-hand side here, he co-founds it with Lucien Febvre, his long-term collaborator, in 1929. The journal that they found and the school that they found of historical thought becomes a professional learning community. And through that professional learning community, they seek to create a shared set of identity, a shared set of learning, shared involvement with the people who are part of it, and enact change. So for those of you who don't know much about the Annales School, and it used to be kind of standard on most survey courses in universities, but I don't know anymore, I'll give you a quick rundown. Both Bloch and Febvre in the 1920s felt that much of the history that was taught in the world of academic history and in universities in France was very, very narrow. It was very political. It served very narrow ends, and it ultimately resulted in deep problems because it silenced voices, it ignored big chunks of history. It was more obsessed with, he thought, hero worship. Febvre called it butterfly collecting, sort of pinning dead specimens on a board. And Bloch criticised particularly the sort of ignorance of history in the longer time. So when the Annales School was founded, for Bloch and Febvre, this was very much about creating a community that was dedicated to the study of social and economic history as well as political, that focused on the longue durée, so the kind of longer periods of history. So there are some amazing pieces. Bloch writes very famously the Royal Touch, which charts the belief that touching or the touch of a royal could cure you of various diseases, and he charts that through hundreds of years of history and tries to explain why that is there. So rather than just focusing on just a few hundred years of recent French history. That it was multinational history, that you could study not just the powerful and the powerful men, especially of history, but you could try and unpick and think about the humanity of the past by thinking about how people thought in the past, studying the mentalities of the people who lived then, trying to understand why, as Bloch once put it, when people in the Middle Ages looked to the clouds, they saw sacred swords, and we don't today. So he was very much about that idea, and particularly in the 1920s, they were both very keen to focus on a critical engagement with evidence and a relentless pursuit of truth and justice. And that was particularly in light of the fact there was a kind of growing problem of nationalism, as you will know from your own history in this period, and that was deeply influencing the way that history was being taught and the nationalist narratives that were being put forwards. And for Bloch, there was a bigger overarching principle as well, because he argued that people in France in the 20th century were being cheated of a history that helped them understand the world that they lived in. And he very much talked about the Annales School being an endeavour towards a better understanding. So the Annales School is founded in 29, and it begins to attract a whole range of people who are interested in similar things. And crucially, it becomes a centre point for discussion and debate. Shared dialogue begins to emerge. People publish things in the article and they respond to each other. It leads to really rich discussions about what history could and should be, and opens up whole new avenues of historical study. So the Annales School is not just a professional learning community that kind of sits within itself and is part of discussions between a small group of people. It becomes a community that can enact change more widely. And Bloch, in 1942, writes a book called The Historian's Craft. And if you haven't read The Historian's Craft, can I please recommend you go and read it, because it's a fantastic book. It's a manifesto on what writing and doing history should be all about. And as Bloch talks about here, writing history with integrity and truth. But what's really interesting about the book for me is, whilst it's Bloch's writing, and it's definitely Bloch's character that comes through in The Historian's Craft, it's very much a product of the thinking of that whole community, that professional community that is the Annales School of History. So all those ideas that come out are the refinement of Bloch's thinking over a decade of working as part of that group of people. And ultimately, over the long term, it is one of the major drivers and contributors to a shift in historical study away from those kind of narrow political narratives that we saw at the turn of the 20th century, the late 19th century, turn of the 20th century, and towards a more inclusive version of history, a broad and deepened history, as Bloch calls it, that certainly by the 1960s was taking root right across Europe. And it's not just, of course, the Annales School that drives that, but it's a major contributor. So through that community, change begins to happen in the way that history is studied. And I think that is such a powerful example of what professional communities can do at their very best.
Alex, I'm sorry to interrupt if this is just me, but we seem to have lost audio for you. Can people hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Ah, great. And sorry to have interrupted. Alex, are you still there? Oh dear, we lost our keynote speaker temporarily.
Okay, folks, in the joyous manner of all things technology, my computer has just up completely, but it's fine. I will continue on my phone for a minute while I reload everything back in. So I have no idea where people last heard that.
We were just talking about the Annales School being a good example of a professional community. So the slide with the bubbles on.
See, Hannah was absolutely right when she stuck with paper earlier. That's all I'm saying. So we've got this idea that communities, these professional communities, have a real importance. They can empower us, inspire us, support us, challenge us. And if we take that example over and we start to think about, well, what can professional learning communities offer us in history education? The answers actually are very, very similar. Really good professional communities empower us as teachers to be better. They inspire us to want to be better. And they have that support and challenge so that we work alongside other people to get better at the kinds of history that we teach or the kinds of history that we do. And that, to me, speaks to what Christine Council talked about when she is discussing professional communities. These are the kinds of debates and discussions that exist all the time there. Okay, I'm hopefully going to rejoin you now from APC, but we will see.
We can see you, Alex, but I'm afraid I can't hear you.
There we go. Right. It's all the issues this evening. So we've got professional communities that can do all of these things for us. Now, if we go back to lovely RQT-Me that I introduced you to a short while ago, the professional communities I was part of, I was definitely part of professional communities, but the range of those communities was quite different, and it didn't necessarily have a direct impact on the history teaching I was doing. So as an RQT in this very challenging school circumstance, I found myself, yes, definitely part of a professional community of teachers who taught in that school. And as a whole staff team, we talked about issues, and those largely revolved around dealing with behavior, managing the kind of the closure of the school and a whole range of other things. And those things certainly moved on my understanding of what it meant to teach in a broad sense, and what social justice really meant when we are teaching in a school environment. But if we think about the other communities I was part of at the same time, I was still kind of loosely connected to the PGCE community I'd had, and the host departments that I'd been in, and those kind of sat there and they were still there. But the experiences I'd had there felt very remote from what was happening at this very tiny middle school. As a history teacher, I was much more isolated. I was the only history teacher in that school. Everybody else taught, and I taught not just history, but a lot of other subjects as well. And therefore, it was quite a lonely experience. And I didn't really know who to turn to or who to talk with about teaching history at all. And to be fair, I didn't go and seek anything either, because I thought that actually the other things were more important than that juncture. And I think looking back now, I wish I'd sought some community a bit earlier. Equally, I was still part of what I thought was an academic community. So I read and I was interested in still listening to historians talk about things. And I didn't know how that fitted, apart from one lesson I tried to teach on medieval guilds, which went horrendously badly in this school. And then I kind of abandoned it forever. Now, if we fast forward a little bit, this is another lovely photo of me from about a year later. And this is RQT+1 me. And I joined a new school and a new department, and this was a really fundamentally different place to work. And it was different in a couple of important respects. First of all, I joined a really thriving history department, and there are on the left, you can see two of my department members here. Both of these I haven't worked with for 10 years, but both people I keep in touch with quite regularly and still talk with about history and history teaching, because, you know, I'm quite tragic like that. And there's a couple of mathematicians sneaking in here, or a mathematician and geography who snuck in as well. So a big part of my identity in this new school was being part of this departmental community. And it was so fantastically different because it was a department that really discussed history. So I can remember joining that department and thinking how amazing it was. We talked about what we were teaching in history in the coming term, or we talked about the kinds of things we'd watched on TV or read, and thought about how we might want to bring those into our teaching in future. It was a departmental community in which history mattered and was pretty central to the kind of work we did. And I'm really grateful for that experience because it helped me see the role that community could play. And particularly Barbara, who's the head of department, you can see in green there, used to bring books in. She used to love going to kind of bargain bookshops and bringing in history books that she'd found, and they would all go away and read them and come back and think about how we might amend or alter what we did. But it was more than just that. It wasn't just being part of a departmental community. Through that experience, I was also encouraged to be part of other communities as well. And so I was sent off to join the Princess Teaching Institute and be part of that community. Katie Hall on the left-hand side here made me read teaching history, because basically during my PGC I had done very little reading. I'm not sure if that was because it wasn't there or because I didn't do it, but one of those things had happened. And Katie essentially treated me like a new teacher the moment I arrived, and she gave me a lot of things and said, go away and read these. And you know what? I read teaching history and I got access to a whole range of articles written by teachers like me who were struggling with similar issues. And so I read Counsel on Evidential Thinking and Chapman and Woodcock on causation, and Alphonse the Camel made appearances in my lessons on causation. So it gave me a lot of food for thought, and it enabled me to move my practice on through a community that were writing through a journal, much like the Annales School. Academic history came back in through that, and you'll have seen that in some of the sessions today. And crucially, Barbara was very keen for us to go and join community events. So I went to the School's History Project conference for the first time at this school and joined in that particular experience. And I want to talk about that because that is probably the one that had the biggest impact on me. The School's History Project has run a summer conference for a long, long time now. But for those of you who don't know much about us and the School's History Project, it was founded in the 70s with a very explicit aim to meet the needs of young people in education, in history education, as we moved into a kind of more comprehensive schooling system. It was started from the ground, thinking with principle about what it is that children need from history education. And I think being part of the School's History Project and going to those conferences spoke to me, because I could see how all of those things were rooted in these key principles the School's History Project have. And those principles have changed a little over the years, but here are the 6. And I just wanted to put them up here, and I'm sure people have touched on these over the course of the day anyway. But I think they're just so crucial to the work that happens. So that school history should be meaningful and enable young people to better understand the world, much like Bloch was talking about. And there's definitely influences there. That school history should involve inquiry and enable young people to develop ideas and opinions about the past. That, you know, the history they study shouldn't just be received and learnt. They need to think about it as well and develop their own ideas about it. That it should build knowledge of the past, absolutely, but it should have a respect for the people who lived in the past. That school history should be broad and inclusive and reflect diversity in modern Britain. And my goodness, that's been a big theme that's come through recently. And it's been part of the SHP's mission for a long time. Not always as central as maybe it should have been, but it has been there, and it's been important in works. And you can see on the right here some of the textbooks that SHP have published over the years that look at things that are current issues, like the impact of empire. That school history should enable young people to see history in the environment around them and understand not just that history happened in the past, but it happened in places around me, and not just at castles, but, you know, a study of your local high street and the history behind it, so that children can kind of develop a leisure interest in history as it was originally framed for the School's History Project. And crucially for me, that school history should be enjoyable, accessible, and life enhancing for everyone. So those 6 principles basically underpinned lots of the stuff I encountered in the textbooks that Schools History Project produced, and they've produced many hundreds or millions of copies have been sold over the years, but also at the conferences where people would go and they would discuss and they would debate and they would talk about the ideas that they had been working on in relation to these principles. And so when I first went to that conference, I can remember being completely blown away by the idea that I would go to a conference for a weekend and people just like me would come in and talk about the teaching they'd been doing, rooted in these principles, how it was impacting on their students. And then we'd go away and we'd have dinner somewhere at the conference and we'd all talk about it. And I can remember having a conversation about teaching the English Reformation at like 1 a.m. with someone and thinking, what an amazing community of people to be talking to about history teaching. So it was really exciting. It was really an eye-opening experience. And that experience led me to start taking part in that community. So the things that I went and saw at these conferences, I then started to enact in classrooms. And so Michael Riley's session on teaching medieval Baghdad turned into a unit comparing medieval London and Baghdad, which you can see a rough bit off here. I went and watched a couple of sessions with Ben Walsh and a number of other people looking at getting historical interpretations more into the classroom. And so we started working in some sessions, and this was in our departmental discussions, about how do we teach historical interpretation and representation. And we asked this question, why do we have to be so careful when telling stories about the Aztecs? And using a book that was quite popular at the time, these Horrible Histories series books. I think the film, the TV is probably more popular now. But this kind of idea, angry Aztecs, what's the problem with this representation? Let's go back to some of the source materials and start thinking about challenging maybe that representation that comes through that children are absorbing. There was issues of accessibility too. You know, that final point about history being accessible for all was really crucial. And actually this piece of work came off an article published by Rachel Foster in Teaching History, but also a session she did and a conversation we had at Schools History Project about how we could deal with a really, I don't know about you, but teaching the Reformation is monstrously hard and complex. And getting students to do what we wanted to do, which was see the changes brought by the Reformation over the long Reformation, so 70 odd years, was really difficult. And we wanted some alternatives for how we could get even our, students who were at least academically achieving at the point to access this. Well, that gave us an into this because Rachel Foster had done some amazing work on how do you get children to represent change through a kind of a graphical format, a roadmap. And so here you can see some children or a child charting the journey of Catholic John and Joan through the Reformation and the kind of stumbling blocks on their route and the turning points and what made their journey harder and their journey easier. And what was lovely about this was it made the English Reformation both accessible and interesting to pupils who actually really would have struggled with this otherwise. So that was really powerful, and it came out of those discussions that we had as part of that professional community. And we also wanted to think about this idea of humanizing the past and respecting the past. And in 2014, this picture did the rounds quite a lot, which was the selfie at Auschwitz, the very infamous now selfie at Auschwitz. And it on the back of some work that Michael Riley, as director of SHP, had done with us as a school in a couple of years previously, thinking about generalizations about the Holocaust and how we approach the Holocaust and how we humanize the Holocaust. We wanted to do something here. And again, this came out of discussions that happened at Schools History Project Conference. And so we ended up doing this piece which said, okay, how should we remember the Holocaust? And we started with this selfie and the kind of the outrage that comes with that. And then we went on to look at other people take photographs at Auschwitz. So where do we start drawing the line? And it eventually went down to the idea, and we brought in some survivor testimony, of course, and this is Ibby Nil, he used to come into school for us, talking about the importance of listening to the voices of the people who actually lived through these things. And then we went on and we used this, which I'm not going to go through now, but you can kind of see it. This is an advert for Stag Do that in 2014 was advertising trips to Auschwitz as part of a stag do. And what we ended up doing was getting the children to write letters to this company to explain why this was really problematic. So again, it was about connecting and humanizing the past, but also listening to survivor testimony. We used that in the work we did here. So I hope what I've illustrated there, I'm afraid I'm kind of rushing a tiny bit through this because of the lovely connection problems we've had. I hope what I'm illustrating here is that being part of a professional community, and several professional communities actually, really helped me develop my practice. But it didn't just develop my practice, it developed our whole practice as a department. And of course, lots of those things we did then went on to influence the conversations we had in our local history networks in Leeds and in Harrogate, and went on further still and became part of some things that I then presented back at SHP in future years. So professional communities can do all these things. They empower us, inspire, support, and challenge. And if they have really good underpinning principles, then they can lead to really positive outcomes so that all young people benefit from engaging, rigorous, life-enhancing history in the way that I've shown with School's History Project there. But I did say I wanted to touch on some of the limits of communities as well. The problem is with communities is you can unite people around any number of principles, and not all communities unite as a positive force for, as Bloch would put it, truth and justice, or rigorous enhancing life, enhancing history, as I've talked about there with this. You can see an image here, which is a depiction of the Chartist Rising in Newport in 1839. And again, for those of you who don't know much about this, the 1838 Chartist petition for the expansion of the franchise and secret ballot and yearly elections and so on was rejected in 1838. It led to an uprising in 1839 against the authorities, during which 22 Chartists were killed. And that community of Chartists were able to unify around a common cause that wanted to bring the expansion of the franchise more widely. But a kind of community looking for political change to deal with unfairnesses of the system could equally unify around a different cause. This that we saw just a few weeks ago is a community being united in an action. Just this time, we don't necessarily, I hope, we don't necessarily agree with the principles that are driving it. And I think there's a reason for that, because actually if we start thinking about the principles that underpin some communities, they're not always inclusive. They're not always about seeking justice for everybody. They're not always about some of those liberal values that we might hold as really, really important, that are about advancing the good of everyone. So, you know, the Make America Great Again movement, Donald Trump, the one thing he was very good at, of course, was unifying people around a cause, but a cause that's got a narrow set of goals. And so we have an issue, and you can see a kind of similar outpouring here, I think, in the way that in our contemporary culture, we've whipped up a kind of community spirit around some very negative aspects as well. I'm not going to delve into those right now. So communities can act in these really positive ways. They can empower, inspire, support, challenge. But equally, if your shared principles are problematic, if your shared principles are not inclusive, if your shared principles don't respect everyone, you can also have communities that exclude people. You have communities that silence people. You have communities that ignore people and seek to preserve their own influence and their own power. So community isn't automatically a positive thing. Communities take thought and communities take work, and they require us to make ethical choices about where we spend our time. And that, of course, means if you have communities like that, we end up with narrow results, narrow benefits for just a few people. Now, when I talked about Marc Bloch and the establishment of the Annales School earlier, I painted that as quite a positive picture. And I talked about the fact that Bloch was seeking to promote a new type of history. But actually, the reality of it is that Bloch, when he is busy in this establishment of the school, is also busy in a struggle against other communities in the discipline of history who were seeking to stifle those voices, who didn't think history should be broadened, who didn't think it was appropriate to look at history in the longue durée or study the mentalities of ordinary people. So Bloch, actually, when he's talking about the wider discipline of history, often refers to them as the guild. And the guild brings up, I think, quite a different image of community. To me, the guild, going back to my medieval guilds, brings up a concept of people who are trying to control others, people who are kind of narrow and a limited group of people, you're kind of the select, elect few, people who are trying to Right, tell me if that is any better, somebody. Better, marvelous. Okay, I could literally, right, I've got a list of tech problems. What are we going to go for next, do we think, before we finish this one? Okay, so Bloch is kind of challenging what he sees as the guild being very narrow. And of course, Bloch, as a Jewish historian, is not just an outsider because of the version of history he believes in, but also in turn of the century and 1920s France, he's an outsider because of the deep-rooted anti-Semitism in France in that period. And so Bloch, although he works at the University of Strasbourg, and he loves his time there, he has to work there because it's a new university and it's pretty much the only place he was able to get tenure. And it takes a very long time and a lot of influence for him to find a role at the Sorbonne. So there are some sort of deep-rooted problems, and those problems only get worse. So, of course, as you will all know, in 1940, France falls in the invasion, the Nazi invasion of France. We've got this very iconic image. Bloch indeed writes about the fall of France in a book called Strange Defeat, in which he deals with why does it happen, and he links that back to history. Actually, it's a fascinating book if you can get hold of it. It's quite rare now. So once France has kind of capitulated and the Vichy regime has been established, the problem becomes even more pronounced, because Bloch is not just trying to challenge a narrowness in historical study, which he's been challenging up until this point, but he's now equally having to challenge the erosion of the fundamental principles on which history is based. And he talks about the way in which the use and abuse of truth in history is happening as the kind of Nazi control and the Nazification of the French academic system takes root. And he very much goes into this idea when he writes The Historian's Craft. He talks about the need to teach history with integrity and truth, and research history with integrity and truth. And he talks about the growing gangrene in the French historical community, which is creating fraud in the study of history. And he takes aim not just at the guild, who he sees as completely complicit, these other communities of historians, he sees as complicit in the continuing erosion of truth in history and using it for these horrendous political ends. But he also takes aim at school teachers, who he says, it's a scandal in our own age, which is more than ever exposed to the poisons of fraud and false rumor. And my goodness, that could have been written, last week, that the critical method is so completely absent from our school programs. So Bloch is now having to go beyond just defending a version of history, and he's now trying to defend the fundamental liberal principles on which historical truth and those ideas are based. And although the problems that we face in the history teaching community and within history teaching communities maybe not quite that extreme, we do still have problems in what we might call that broader history teaching community, so the sub-communities that make that up. Lots of the narrative around history teaching, and when Ofsted talks about the history teaching community, is really a narrative that's dominated by powerful communities and powerful voices. And lots of those powerful voices have failed to challenge or failed to sufficiently challenge some of the deep problems that still exist in our school system, and particularly in history teaching. And for me, I'm going to pick out a number of them here. One is a lack of inclusivity for young people. So that idea that history is for everybody, not just a few. Secondly, a pedagogical narrowing that's been occurring over the last 10 years, certainly. Thirdly, that there are continued silences in the curriculum and a growth of the national narrative as the narrative, or the nationalist narrative in some cases. And finally, that there are silences in the teaching community itself, so that some voices are heard and others aren't, and some voices really are sidelined and haven't been heard, and really are struggling to get a voice in the community. And I think there hasn't been enough challenge to some of these things. So although there is a fantastic, thriving set of communities in history teaching, these problems are still there despite that, and we need to think about what they are and how we challenge them. So to take that very briefly, there is a problem of accessibility. We know that new history GCSEs are substantially harder than old ones. What does that mean? Well, it means in the longer term and the longer run, students who struggle with history are being advised not to take it at all. So they are being robbed of an opportunity to study history further. Now, that's not happening everywhere, but it is happening more than you might like to think. It also means that progression is poor. It's nearly a third, 40% harder to get a grade C or a grade 4 than it used to be under the old GCSE. And that pure difficulty is making that transition for students from GCSE into A-level history study, for example, harder. It's becoming more and more difficult for students to do history. And we've also got problems with accessibility for students with special educational needs. The focus on larger and larger amounts of purely written history, although there's great benefit to that, is also meaning there are issues of access for some students. And actually, there's a terrible uptake of history at A-level still for pupils with special educational needs. That hasn't been resolved over the last 10 years. It hasn't been resolved over the last 30 years. And therefore, there's not enough, I think, being said in powerful voices talking about this kind of issue. We talked briefly about pedagogy, what I call the input-recall-pitfall. The Ofsted Inspection Handbook talks about teachers needing to be subject experts. It talks about pupils needing to know important knowledge. It talks at the bottom here, subject curriculum is designed and delivered in a way that allows pupils to transfer key knowledge into long-term memory and sequence so that new knowledge and skills build on what's been taught before. And do you know what? There's nothing wrong, essentially, with that statement as an outcome. But if you take that as a kind of a map for how you should do your pedagogy, it becomes more problematic. And we start to see that the advice on how do we do teaching becomes little more than this. And this is an example taken from a teacher guide to a textbook, which basically advises the best way forward is to read the material and then condense it by turning that material into a new format. Now, again, there's a place for that kind of work, but if that's all you're doing in history, where do we get the point where students engage with something, develop opinions about something, process something properly, and it doesn't just become transmitting one to the other? And that's particularly problematic if you couple it with some of the more extreme ends of how we manage classrooms. And this comes from a real school. I'm not going to go into which one at this point. We get phrasing like this. And again, like I say, this is the extreme end, but your teacher is the expert. Your teacher decides the rules. And I agree, your teacher decides the rules, but you might not agree with what your teacher's saying. It doesn't matter, your teacher is the boss. Well, now your input recall pedagogy becomes really problematic because what we're talking about is silencing the voices of students in the classroom. And I appreciate there are times when you need students to do what they're told, but there are also times when students need to be given opportunities to think and to express ideas and to dissent as well in the classroom about the topic that they're being taught. Okay, this continues in, and I suppose in a similar vein, that idea that the cultural capital has become kind of a buzzword, hasn't it? And powerful knowledge has become a buzzword. And I agree, students need powerful knowledge, but who determines what knowledge is powerful? And the problem is that powerful knowledge can quickly be interpreted as a traditional curriculum. And in fact, if you look at the bottom example I've got here, you can see how one school has literally interpreted it as the traditional curriculum. And they talk the content of the history curriculum at school is chosen to best illustrate the powerful knowledge which historians should own. That's an interesting choice of phrase. The development of England over a few hundred years, from tribal squabbling to a first coherent parliament. The slow struggle against slavery and prejudice in the 19th century. It's an incredibly Whiggish story of the nation's development. And, you know, yes, we might want to cover some of the things in their curriculum that you can see on the right-hand side here, but is that the story we want students to go away with? Or is actually that a problematic narrative? And I think it is a problematic narrative, actually. But it's almost given credence because nobody's quite clear, or there aren't enough powerful voices saying, when we talk about a powerful knowledge narrative, we don't just mean this national story. And if you look at the curriculum example at the top, I think there's an equally problematic thing there. Year 7, Anglo-Saxons, medieval kings, crusades, late medieval, Henry VIII and the age of exploration. That's a lot of political history. It's almost exclusively political history. It's almost exclusively going to be about powerful people, maybe with the exception of late medieval. We've got problematic framings like the age of exploration rather than the age of colonization, for example. Where are the first women going to appear in this curriculum? When are students first going to encounter their first person of colour in this curriculum? Likely in terms of slavery, and we already know the problems that come with that. So there are deep problems of curriculum, and those go not just into where schools are doing these things. And I should say both of those places are academies, so those curricula are new, or at least within the last 10 years. This is a textbook published in 2018, and you can see the same kinds of problematic silencing happening in the kinds of knowledge that's being promoted in here. So we talk here about the age of encounters, again, problematic. The framing is quite colonial. Columbus's journey across the Atlantic blew the world wide open. Soon a constant stream of explorers was sailing from Portugal and Spain to explore new islands further. The colonial aspects of this aren't really mentioned at all here. The impact, what about the indigenous peoples who had to experience those colonizers arriving? Down here, we've got missing context. In 1516, Spain's ruler Charles V authorized further exploration of the American mainland, and so Spanish explorers became known as conquistadors. We don't unpick that conquistadors basically means they were involved in mass annihilation of indigenous populations. That's not covered here. It's missing knowledge, and therefore, where's the power in this knowledge? And yet this is a textbook that's published in 2018. Later on, it talks about Moctezuma and the Spanish, the relationship between them souring, as if somehow it was kind of a mixed effort, rather than Cortes being actively involved in massacring 2 villages before he goes to take on Moctezuma in Tenochtitlan. So there are deep problems, and the kind of questions that are being asked on the back of this, which you can kind of read at the bottom here, really don't enter into any of those issues of narrative. There are not enough communities, professional communities in history teaching, or powerful voices saying that this is wrong. There are some, but not enough of the powerful ones. Okay, I like this from Eric Foner. I think it speaks to what we just talked about there. This history, he's talking about American history, but he talks, this history we were taught could not have produced the present we were living in. And I think that's such a powerful way of framing this. The history that those curricula outline and the history in that textbook could not have produced the present we are living in. And therefore, that does a disservice to students and young people in schools. And actually, it has a direct impact on pupils in schools. Teni Aladin did an amazing, or wrote an amazing article, which is published in the most recent Teaching History, in which she looks at the impact of these narrow curricular constructions on her pupils, or ex-pupils in this case, or pupils who had been taught these curricula. And just taking some extracts here, Abigail, 21, I was taught history like people who looked like me didn't even exist. I remember being taught about the British Empire and having to list reasons why it was important for Britain to colonise parts of Africa. Shola, I eventually got fed up with the fact that the only people who looked like me were slaves or descendants of slaves. This problem still exists. It's not gone away. People are talking about it here. And if we look at these examples, we hear about our history of slavery. You want to point out to children that black contribution to the world is just as valuable as the white contribution. We get it from the white angle all the time. It's like Africa never existed. Those are comments made in the Swan Report in 1985. There's 36 years between those two sets of student comments on what they're being taught, and there's not a vast amount of change between them. That tells us not enough is happening in history teaching communities to challenge these things, or rather, not enough is enabling those power shifts to happen to enable this change to go ahead. There are also missing voices. We talked about the fact that some voices are absent. If we look at teaching history, and I'm not singling it out, but it is the journal that kind of goes with history teaching. Between 2014 and 2019, only 5 articles in teaching history dealt with issues of curricular diversity explicitly, and only 2 of those dealt very particularly with race, and they were both by the same group of authors. And that's out of about 170 articles. There were about 20 in the same period on the theme of powerful knowledge, for example. And the RHS Race Report, published in 2018, shows us there's already a massive underrepresentation of students from BME backgrounds studying undergraduate history, postgraduate history, in positions of professorship, for example, in universities, or just teaching roles in universities. And BME trainees are massively underrepresented in history teacher training. So the voices to challenge these things are also absent as well. And that is improving, but it's improving very slowly. And if we look at where the dominant voices are, well, let's have a look at some of the things that are happening. The curriculum reforms that Michael Gove brought in 2013, which led to many of these curriculum constructions we looked at, were backed by historians like David Starkey. And of course, you will know recently that David Starkey has rather shown his true colours and been disowned, frankly, by most of the history community. But those are the kinds of shaping influences. If we look at dominant voices at really big conferences, people like John Blake here is talking about practical strategies for building knowledge-rich curricula and what a knowledge-rich curriculum looks like. Robert Peel talking about how textbooks can underpin a rigorous knowledge-based history. Well, John Blake works at one of the schools that produced one of those curricula we looked at before, and Robert Peel wrote that textbook. So again, these are powerful voices. They're not necessarily voices that are seeing the issue, whether that is because they don't see the issue, because they're choosing to ignore the issue, I'm not going to get into here. And then we get non-historians as well shaping the debate. Catherine Burblesing of Michaela Free School talking here about putting dead white men back on the timetable, as if somehow they'd left it, which I think is an interesting take on it. And you know what? There are amazing things that happen at Michaela Free School, but this intervention in the debate as a powerful head teacher, as part of a powerful free school, shapes the way other schools think about what they should be doing with their curriculum. And this tells them, put more traditional curriculum in place. There are deep, deep problems here. So there are these big issues sat in, I think, the way that history teaching is happening, and they're not everywhere, but they are still there, and we need to be aware of that. There is that lack of inclusivity, there is a pedagogical narrowing, there are silences in curriculum and silences within the history teaching community itself. And for me, the best way that we push back against that is through communities, because through communities which have shared principles, we can begin to start to make inroads and push back and say, this is not the way we want it to be done. And just like the Annales School ultimately influenced the way history developed, so too, by choosing really good communities to be part of and principal communities to be part of, we can then start to push back and say, well, this is how we can change things and be part of the difference. So with the final thing, and with an awareness that I've got little time left, but I'm sure there'll be a recording if you're not able to stay for the very end of this, and apologies for all the interruptions. The big question we really have is, okay, we've all got limited time. I talked at the beginning about the fact that I went from being too isolated at the beginning of my career to probably being trying to do too much. So how do we choose which communities we dedicate our time to? Well, I think for a start, we need to be able to make some ethical choices about the communities we spend our time in. And I think there are two fundamental tests. First of all, does a community have principles and make them clear? Any community will have some principles. Whether or not it makes them obvious is one thing. And once those principles are clear, are they defensible? And for me, my test is always, are those principles involved with addressing the needs of young people? And if they are rooted in the needs and the inclusion of young people, then that for me is a good sign that those principles are positive. If you want other tests, you might look at things like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which has 3 articles specifically on children's right to education, the kind of education they should get. But I think we need to make some ethical choices that go beyond, will it get good exam results for young people? Although that is, of course, important. So I want to introduce a just quick framework that might help us make some ethical choices. So when we are thinking about the professional communities that we can opt to be part of, we will of course be part of some by default, we'll be part of our department, a part of our school. But when we come to choosing them, what will help us make those decisions well? And this is based on some of the work that Bloch has done, but it's also based on the idea of what a humanist education should be all about, and a humanizing education. So my first question is a community that you're taking part in open and inclusive? Can anyone join? Does it look to be more diverse? It's certainly something as part of School's History Project we are looking to at the moment. Does it have principles, and are they rooted in the needs of all children, not just the children you teach, but all children? And do they help tackle the problems that young people face in education today? If they have principles and they do those things, that's probably a good sign. Does it seek justice and truth through its actions? Again, borrowing from some Bloch's phrasing there. Does the community challenge those powerful voices, or does it not challenge them? Does it let that status quo continue? Because sometimes communities don't speak out for fear of damaging their own position, and I think that can be a problem, and that's been a problem with all communities over time. But we need to think about that. Does it seek to look for a more accurate past? And I think for history teachers that's important. Does it prioritize learning and participation? Is there a shared body of knowledge that we're drawing on, but equally is participation prioritized? So it's not just about consuming that knowledge, it's about being part of creating it and maintaining it and continuing it into the future. Does it enable members to have a positive impact on students? I think it's fairly straightforward. And is it honest and open to criticism? So does the community seek to understand where it's fallen short, and does it try and remedy things when it's fallen short? Well, those for me are the framework that I think you can use. And I just want to take a couple of examples here to illustrate how that might work. I want to start with exam board communities, because you can get these on Facebook, and they're actually lovely places to go to. You can see at the AQA one, I've just picked, there's no particular reason I picked that one. Are they open and inclusive? Well, yeah, they are. Look, it's 4,500 members of this one. Anyone can join. I mean, presumably you'd probably want to be in the same exam board, but you could join anyway. Do they share things? Yeah, they absolutely do. There's some amazing people in exam board communities that share loads of stuff, and people benefit from that hugely. And therefore it enables people to have a positive impact on their students. Does it prioritize participation? Well, I think that's where we're getting slightly less clear, because I think sometimes the emphasis is on, for lots of people, using the resources that are there, not necessarily the participation, although some people do, not everybody does. Does it have principles rooted in the needs of all children? Well, actually, the principles, by definition, are almost limited to the exam elements. And actually, some of the more problematic things that come out of this are when it doesn't necessarily tally with exam aims. And I sometimes see conversations like this one, Ofsted are all about curriculum design now. Our school have done the standard work to try and appease them, but I wonder what else we can do to tick the boxes. And I think that probably doesn't speak to everybody being part of a principled community. But then again, that's not what they're necessarily for. But it is a question about how much time you dedicate to spending in those communities and what you use them for, I think. And it's similar for local authority networks. I used to be part of a head of history network, which had similar kind of approach. Its aims were pretty narrow on ensuring good outcomes for exams, rather than necessarily broader educational issues about enjoyment, say, for example. What about research ed? Well, this is a pretty popular thing. It's become huge over the last 5-7 years. It's definitely open. You can definitely go along. It's pretty cheap. So it's very little money to get a ticket to that. Does it enable people to become better teachers? Well, yes and no. It does in a way. There's lots of things you can pick up at Research Ed, and I've been to some great sessions at Research Ed conferences. But equally, it's often quite generic. It's not history specific. So will it make you a better history teacher? Well, that's debatable. It's not always all applicable. Does it prioritize participation? Well, actually, I think there's a thing with Research Ed increasingly, which is what I call the cult of the edu celebrity. And you can see here the sessions outlined are just people's names. And that idea that you go and learn from them, like CPD, rather than being part of a conversation where you are jointly building knowledge together. And so I think there is an issue there. Does it have principles? Well, actually, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because Research Ed actively says it doesn't. And its strapline, you can see it on this ticket here, is working out what works, as if somehow you could sidestep the issue of principles. And the problem is, if you do that, you end up in hot water, I think, because I don't know how many of you saw the row over Andrew Sabisky being appointed as an advisor to Downing Street this summer. But, he had to quit pretty quickly. Because it transpired that his views on intelligence and genetics and eugenics especially were really quite extreme and problematic. But he was invited on more than one occasion to present at Research Ed, and I know because I went to one of those sessions. And the problem is, when you don't have a set of principles that say, is this fitting with inclusive education for everybody, you don't necessarily have a way of stopping those kinds of sessions from happening. So some deeply problematic ideas are shared in those sessions, and not everybody who's in them knows how to challenge them or knows that they might be problematic in the first place. Now, everybody can make mistakes, but is Research Ed honest and open to criticism about that? Well, you can't find any reference to Andrew Sabisky on their website anymore, so I'm going to say probably not as much as maybe they should be. Schools History Project I've talked about already, so I'm not going to do massively here, but hopefully I've illustrated how it does many of these things. Does it do everything perfectly? No, absolutely not. I think we're trying to do a lot more at the moment about prioritising that participation. Everybody has always been able to propose an idea for a conference session or run something, but we've also started working towards getting people to share through Twitter. For example, there's one example here of a history department going away and trying something out in the classroom and sharing it back, and also the new teacher planning groups. So you can go and get involved. You can go and sit with teachers and think about how you might plan a Key Stage 3 unit. And they're really teacher led. So there's lots of ways to get involved there. And hopefully you can see how at least SHP is based in these kind of principles that are rooted in the needs of young people to have this kind of rigorous, engaging, powerful history. And of course, there are others as well. Although I flagged teaching history as having some real holes in its publication over the last 5 years or so, its most recent issues, certainly over the last year, have brought out some amazing pieces of research into making curriculum more inclusive. So there is definitely a positive move there. Justice to History. Again, they've been doing some amazing sessions through HA, actually, and looking at the way we can teach a more inclusive history curriculum. And you can go and join that. You can go and become part of that movement. Same with Be Bold History Network. There are many others. what I would suggest is, if you want to dedicate your time to one of these or spend time with it, use that framework as a way of thinking about whether it's going to have a really good impact. So the final thing I want to just talk about is what does it look like to be part of those communities? So when you have chosen a community, how do you take an active part in it? And I'm going to talk about this as being defending principles through action. We talked already about the fall of France in 1940. By 1942, of course, the complete overthrow of the Vichy regime and the kind of taking over of France occurs. And at this point, Bloch goes from just being part of a community of historians challenging what's going on, and he shifts into actually joining the French resistance, because what he realizes is that his role is now about defending the principles on which truth is based, and all those kind of fundamental ideas on which any good history sits, but inclusive history and diverse history and all the rest of it, it is being taken away completely. And so Bloch actively decides to fight for those principles as part of a community of French Republicans, fundamentally, in 1942. And for 2 years, he takes an active part in that community in challenging the Nazi takeover of France. And ultimately, we know that they are successful, and the French resistance contribute to the overthrow of the Nazi regime in France ultimately. And we know ultimately that Bloch will be successful in the school that he creates. But of course, he doesn't live to see that. In 1944, Bloch is arrested and he's very quickly tried, and he's taken to face execution by firing squad. And Bloch, at 50 odd years old, in his mid 50s, ends up standing in a field facing a firing squad, and he finds himself stood next to a 16-year-old boy who turns to him and says, "Will it hurt?" And I think what happens next, and we have some eyewitnesses for this, I think what happens next tells us a lot about the way in which communities and principles shape us and define us, and it's partly why I keep coming back to Marc Bloch. Bloch turns to this boy and he says to him, "Only for a short moment." And then he holds his hand, and then he shouts "Vive la France" as the firing squad open fire and they're murdered. And I think that tells us a huge amount about Bloch's commitment to truth and to justice and to the Republican ideal, but crucially also his commitment through all of his historical work to the humanity of the past, and that humanity that he shows in his final moments. It shapes who he is, and it shapes in the longer term the kinds of work that happen that ultimately lead to change and the overthrow of the regime. So mercifully, I think none of us are ever going to be asked to put our life on the line for the communities that we take part in, but we can also be active members and principled members of the communities we are part of. And that means doing a number of things. I think it means being actively inclusive, inviting people to join us in communities, and being open to who we invite in. And if we really want our history teaching communities to be diverse, that starts at the bottom. The RHS report pointed out that a good factor for explaining why so few students from BME backgrounds go into university study is probably due to curricular issues like we've seen already. So if we want long-term change, we need to be committed to attracting young people from diverse backgrounds into history in the first place and into the profession of history teaching. We need to experiment. You've been given loads of ideas today, and I've been watching Twitter, and people have been excited by the kinds of things they've listened to. Go out and experiment with those things. Everything you've done today will be rooted in principles that are SHP principles. Put them into practice, and by doing that, you are taking part in a community. Make a commitment to try something out. Make a commitment to yourself. Pop it on Twitter, something you're definitely going to try out. Join a planning group and come back to us and talk about it. And maybe in a couple of years, you might even want to show what you've been doing at a conference, like an NQT conference, for example. So just take part. And then really crucially, keep talking. Keep talking to each other about these big issues. And you can see here, Jamie Byram at the SHP conference a couple of years ago, floating their boat. How do we get lower attaining students to really enjoy and get something out of history and make progress in their history? We've got Miranda Kaufman here on the top. Who wants to teach Black Tudors? A pleasure to speak to SHP Conference 2019 yesterday. And all those people with their hands up saying, yes, we want to do that. And you know what? I see so many schools now teaching Black Tudors. And that's not just through SHP. it's through other communities as well, but the shift is happening for more diverse teaching of history. Keep asking questions. I thought one fascinating and brilliant thing about Hannah Cusworth's session today was she was presenting some ideas, but she was also asking everybody there questions about her ideas. That conversation is so important. And focusing on the ethical choices that we're making and discussing those are really important. And in doing that, we become part of a community that works with each other and that cares for each other and that helps each other get better. And you can see, I promise you, if you come to an SHP conference, Rich Kerridge won't come and kiss you. But you can see the kind of excitement that people have of being part of that community and joining that community. And crucially for me as well, don't be afraid to challenge. All communities have powerful voices in them. And sometimes those voices don't make the right decisions. If you're part of a community, part of your role, I think, is to hold people to account and say when you think they're getting it wrong. And that's a really important part of a community growing. And if a community can't deal with that, it's probably not a very good community in the first place. And then finally, support your communities. Communities really only are going to thrive through participation. If we want to be able to influence the wider profession, if we want to make sure we can push back against some of these more negative aspects that exist in history teaching, then we need to support the communities that are trying to bring about those changes. I've listed a number of them for you already. There are loads more. But they will thrive only if we are part of them. And we used the Charter as the example earlier, but I don't know how many of you watched the Steve McQueen Small Axe series over the course of this winter, and the mangrove episode of that looked at the Mangrove 9. And I thought what was powerful in there was this was a restaurant that became the heart of a struggle for justice against a corrupt police and justice system in 1960s, 1970s Britain. And although the case is ultimately won in a courtroom, in the Mangrove case, the thing that enables it to happen is the fact that the Mangrove restaurant exists as a place for the Black community of Notting Hill to gather and to think and to have an identity and to push forward ideas that change needs to happen. And that change does ultimately happen. And of course, it's still in progress, but it starts because of a community, and not a community that is taking violent action, like in the Chartist example, but a community that is just there talking about these things and making sure they don't go off the radar, that they continue to be the centre. Thriving communities have the power to change things. Communities that are based in really good principles have the power to change things for the better. And I want to finish then, for those of you who are still here, thank you ever so much for bearing with me, with this Bloch quote, which I'm going to amend ever so slightly. He talks in The Historian's Craft, and he says, "I should like historians, above all the younger ones, and I'm going to add to that history teachers, to reflect on these hesitancies, these incessant soul searchings of our craft. It will be the surest way they can prepare themselves by deliberate choice to direct their efforts reasonably." And ultimately, that's what I'm kind of saying this evening. We have got to wrestle with these decisions about where we spend our time, where we put our efforts in, how we take part in communities and enact change, so that we can, in Bloch's words, pioneer a path to truth and justice. And I think justice is the crucial issue here. I hope that by taking part in real communities of practice, we are able together to start shaping the way that history education is taught over the next decade and more. And that starts in your NQT years, that you're enabled to be really great teachers of history and that you bring about those changes too. And so I'm going to offer you a challenge at the end of this as well. A couple of challenges, really. One, if you might like to go out and just tell us about some of the ways that you are thinking about putting some SHP principles into practice, or ways in which you've used some of the workshop stuff that you've done today, and share it with us. We would love to be in that conversation at 1972 SHP, or me personally, APF 102. Talk to us about what you're doing. Make a commitment with some other people. You know, if you know some of the people who've been here today, have a chat with them about what they've taken from it, what they're going to try out, what they might want to do to start pushing back against some of these problems in history education. Or if you would like to, we'll let you just hang on at the end a little bit and we'll pop you all into a breakout set of groups and you can go and have a chat there and maybe talk with each other about what you've enjoyed, what you're taking from it. And crucially, what I'm asking is, please, get the benefit, get the enjoyment of being part of a community of practice that will enable you to do these amazing things, but also have that the knowledge of the responsibilities that we have as members of those communities. I would love it if you came and joined us as part of SHP and were part of our movement, but I would love it if you did that anywhere else, as long as it does these things and it helps us to create more challenging, more rigorous, more inclusive, more diverse history for every child in the classrooms in which we teach. Thank you ever so much for bearing with me, and I'm going to stop there.